Hello everyone. Today I'm deriving some inspiration from a neighboring communist YouTuber by the name of Socialism for All. Lately he's been doing some excellent polemics and criticizing center-left news pundits from Jimmy Dore to Kyle Kulinski and David Pakman. So I've decided that since there is a great deal of value in criticizing these pundits from the left, that I'm going to throw my hat in the ring and give my thoughts on an older video by Kyle Kulinski's Secular Talk on why he isn't further left.
Okay, Lucky Strike asks, please explain why you disagree with Chomsky's point of view when it comes to a political system, aka why are you a democratic socialist? So, in other words, this person's asking, hey, why are you to the right of a guy like Noam Chomsky? I don't know. By the way, I'm not even necessarily a democratic socialist. They are just to the left of me. I'm a social democrat, which means I'm in favor of a Scandinavian system. I mean, that's why a lot of people listen to the show say I'm right of them, because I probably am, I'm...
So here he's saying he's a social democrat and that he's in favor of the Nordic model, and that's fine and dandy and all, but the problem with this position largely comes from the naivete surrounding it. Many of Kyle's consciousness believe that the system can be reformed in that direction if we simply go through the proper legal channels, work within the system, get the right people elected to the right positions of government, and that the goal can be realized. What our left liberal friend here is not taking into account is that there was a massive degree of struggle that went into attaining those reforms in the first place. Within Denmark, Norway, Switzerland, and Finland are communist parties, trade unions, and organs of workers' power and influence that are organized on their own terms, independent of bourgeois parliament, and that these organizations at one point posed a serious threat to capitalism. Finland, for example, had a civil war that broke out between the revolutionaries and the forces of reaction after World War I. The Reds ended up getting purged and suffered a disproportionate number of losses relative to the Whites. However, in the wake of the Civil War, the Finnish government, and by extension the Finnish ruling class, were poised to give in to a slew of redistributive economic reforms, not only due to the threat of being overthrown, but also because they were now the next-door neighbor to a communist superpower that was guaranteeing its people economic rights and freedom. So you see, Social Democrats, the reforms that you seek came in the wake of decades of class struggle compounded on top of the threat of revolution. Not just in the Nordic countries, but across Western Europe as well. It is thanks to the struggles of the trade union movements as well as socialists and communists of old that we ever got these reforms in the first place, which in the end turned out to be a bribe. A temporary bribe that, now that the Soviet Union is gone, is slowly being rolled back and chipped away at as all of the wealthy Western countries face neoliberal austerity. The same goes for Franklin D. Roosevelt. We got him elected here in the United States because there was a strong, growing malcontent from the proletarian masses and an upsurge in communist activity. By the mid-1930s, there were upwards to 1 million card-carrying communists in America at a time when the population was 1/3 what it is now. So FDR got elected, and the ruling class was poised to give in to his concessions, which even for the most reactionary capitalists were too much. Not a lot of people know this, but in 1937, we had another recession known as FDR's recession, which was caused by the investor class going on a capital strike and halting investments, causing the economy to contract. Hell, in the 1930s, behind closed doors, some Wall Street executives were conspiring and plotting a coup d'etat against FDR and the installation of a military dictatorship here in the United States. Fun fact, Social Democrats. Did you know that after the October Revolution in Russia, when the world's first communist government was formed, that quite literally forced the hand of the global bourgeoisie to give in to shorter work weeks? What you are looking at now is a chart showcasing the global average work week. Before 1918, it was steadily declining, but it was still roughly about 70 hours. However, in the years following the October Revolution in Russia and the emergence of the USSR, global average work weeks would sharply decline all the way down to 50 hours a week by 1940. Is it really a coincidence that the shortening of the work week was only preceded by the ascension of the world's first socialist superpower? Or could it be because the ruling class knows that they have to give in to these concessions or be overthrown? And now all across the developed world, we are currently in a perpetual state of austerity, where governments are poised to cut taxes and deregulate to help the private sector compensate for losses in profitability. Is it really a surprise that now that communism has receded globally, that this is what is going on? This is the reason why I'm not a social democrat. It's because the only time we have ever gotten the reforms and implementation of welfare capitalism that you advocate was when the capitalist class was literally forced by the real threat of socialist revolution to do so. And now that that threat is gone, they have no incentive to keep those reforms around, let alone introduce the reforms you seek to implement. And thus, they slice funding to the government programs so that they can increase their profits at your expense, since every dollar that they pay in taxes is a dollar out of their profits.
I'm kind of in agreement with Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie calls himself a democratic socialist, but when you look at his policy positions, he actually is pretty clearly a social democrat, because he seems to favor like a, Scandinavian system, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden.
Let's talk about the Nordic system real quick. The Nordic countries participate in global imperialism along with the US, Israel, and NATO. They routinely participate in NATO drills and do business with fascist autocrats around the globe. Companies which are based in the Nordic countries, such as Telenor, Statoil, and Nestle, are all guilty of utilizing child and slave labor in the Third World, as well as bribing foreign governments to obtain licenses for resource extraction. Other companies, such as H&M, based in Sweden, are on record for underpaying sweatshop workers pennies an hour in Bangladesh to manufacture their clothing. And we're only scratching the surface of what these countries and their corporations are guilty of. So this notion that the Nordic countries are just these isolated pockets that exist in a vacuum and isn't actively plugged into and participating in global imperialism just because they aren't overtly engaging in this predatory behavior as openly as the United States, the UK, or France is incredibly naive and ignorant. Yes, they have high living standards. Yes, they have a great deal of successful social programs. But are they really model societies that we should be basing our political economy off of? Especially when you consider that their government programs and redistributive tax policies are constantly under attack by reactionary politicians. Especially when you consider that these countries still have an average poverty rate of around 10 to 15%. If your answer is still yes in the wake of that, then what you are effectively saying is it is acceptable for these corporations to work people to death in the Third World for pennies an hour. It is acceptable for our politicians and militaries to murder innocent people around the globe. It is acceptable for 10 to 15% of the population to be living in abject squalor, so long as you get yours, right? Who cares if there's inequality and injustice as long as I got mine, right? That is what the implication that you can ultimately draw from the Kulinskiite mindset is. And even if this isn't your position as a social democrat, once again, under socialism, we could have all of the benefits of the Nordic model that you laud, on top of 0% of the population living in poverty, and an end to the Third World slave labor exploitation, as well as the non-stop military adventurism that gets people bombed to death routinely in the Third World. But once again, you will never achieve this under capitalism, let alone by asking the ruling class to piss on themselves for morals.
'Cause I think once you give people free healthcare, free college, a living wage, once you end the wars, once you give people, real equal opportunity, at that point, I become fine with the meritocracy. If you have the minimum to live a decent life, to live a life free of, degradation, to live a life free of poverty, if you have that bare minimum, then I have no problem then at that point turning around and saying, okay, now it's on you if you want to make it within the context of the system we have here that we've set up.
You know, folks, over 100 years ago, there were two left-wing activists who emerged who thought the same thing, as Kyle does here. All we gotta do is keep reforming capitalism, and eventually, through the system's process of accumulation and wealth creation, combined with our efforts to keep patching it and tweaking it to redistribute wealth in a more kind and sustainable manner, through the struggle for reform, we will end up in a system resembling some kind of socialism someday, since so much wealth will be created that we have enough abundance to redistribute it and still have enough wealth left over for the rich. Kautsky and Bernstein had the same mindset of Kyle 120 years ago, and this was their strain of thought. And I'm happy to say that the last 100 years or so has completely proven them wrong. We let capitalism continue. We continued to struggle for reform, and what has it gotten us? 2 world wars, imperialism, Cold War, the CIA, famine, poverty, exploitation, immiseration, global economic crisis, the retarding of technological development, excess unnecessary death, climate change, and ecological catastrophe. Kyle, your theory has been tried, and it hasn't brought us any closer to socialism. My theory, on the other hand, has brought a third of the planet's population under the red flag at one point.
And you want to feel like there's a little bit of competition going on, and you're going to be better than the next person, and you can beat the next person, and that is an incentive to push and go further. And there is something about the market system in certain industries that makes sense, where you try to create the best product at the cheapest cost.
Human nature and hard work. Nobody is saying that you don't reward people for working hard. I mean, there are some socialists who do, but the idea that you don't pay people for working harder is based on a straw man. In addition, when it comes to innovation, the vast majority of new scientific innovation comes from the public sector, government-funded research. Even in the cases where you can point to new innovation coming from the private sector, it's not within the context of Dick Bob building a better atom smasher in his backyard than his next-door neighbor, Billy Bob Thornton. It comes from dozens or hundreds of scientists working together to fulfill a common goal. Open source and cooperation are a superior source of innovation and, by extension, wealth creation, since everybody cooperating as a group will yield better discoveries over everyone simply trying to hoard proprietary knowledge out of pursuit of competitive market advantage. There is a ton of technology that exists today that is currently being underutilized or not being utilized at all that could solve a slew of social and economic problems, but are fundamentally not profitable and yield no competitive advantage. It's the reason why we don't have bullet trains spanning from east to west coast. It's the reason why the electric car isn't currently in full global use. It's the reason why we aren't setting up thorium reactors across the United States. Hell, I'm willing to bet that if it wasn't for the space race or the Cold War, that we wouldn't even have satellite technology right now.
And, the example I always use is look at the cars that came out of the Soviet Union versus the cars that come out of the U.S. In the U.S., it was capitalism and competition that got us amazing cars that can do amazing things, whereas the ones that came out of the Soviet Union were comical because there's no competition, so nobody's trying to make a better product at a cheaper price.
The reason why cars in the Soviet Union were substandard was because they had a highly efficient and cheap public transit system in the form of trains, trolleys, and buses. Transportation infrastructure was a centralized public utility, and many of the planners felt correctly that more people driving around in atomized little metal boxes would have been overall less efficient and resulted in congested, gridlocked roads over time. And thus, planners didn't commit a lot of resources to building nice cars. This isn't something that is inherent to socialism, Kyle. This was a deliberate, calculated choice. So they didn't have nice cars, so what? They had nice buses, though. Private automobiles are a massive resource sink with respect to fuel and materials, requiring constant servicing and repairs in order to stay roadworthy, are dangerous, and take up massive amounts of space to transport exponentially fewer people than what a train or a shuttle could. But they're profitable. Private automobiles are profitable. From the car dealerships to auto mechanics to the car insurance racket, despite the drawbacks, there is a fuckload of money in the automobile industry. I know that it's hard for Americans to wrap their minds around the notion of not needing a car to get around, or space-efficient city design, or efficient public transit, because our culture is obsessed and all of our transportation infrastructure is designed primarily to accommodate the automobile, and America's need for oil is so great that we have literally gone to war on multiple occasions to secure oil resources. But in the Soviet Union, the former, that is, mass public transit, was prioritized for the aforementioned reasons.
So when it comes to, consumer goods, video games, movies, cars, that's not an issue where I think the government should be involved. And it's an issue where the free market has shown it yields better results.
Okay, so a couple of things. First off, there were video games in the Soviet Union. Second, some of the best movies, cartoons, literature, musicians, and art pieces find their origins in the USSR. There was no shortage of the arts or culture under socialism, and you are unbelievably ignorant if you think otherwise. And thirdly, the government was not in charge of the production of such things. Artists, movie companies, and authors were given subsidies by the government to make whatever kind of projects that they wanted to, so long as it wasn't too critical of the Communist Party. Personally, I find this paradigm to be superior since you don't have artists and directors constantly being pressured to sell out or throw out good ideas or creativity for the sake of appealing to the lowest common denominator. Here in America, you'll often find because movies and music are so commercialized, because investors aren't willing to take risks on exciting new ideas that may or may not succeed, that much of our media nowadays is growing rather stale. When was the last time you saw something genuinely creative come out of Hollywood that wasn't just a rehash or remake of something that was written 30 to 40 years ago? Producers don't want to take risks on anything new or creative anymore, for there's too much money on the line for them to do so, and thus, we're stuck with the same safe but bland manufactured bullshit that just gets rehashed and re-released every 20 to 30 years. This is an area where socialism could do better, since producers aren't pressured by the profit motive to constantly play it safe for the sake of not making something that could potentially flop.
Whereas other issues like healthcare and health insurance and education, the government does it better. So I think the world is not a simple place. It's a complex place. And in some ways, the market system is preferable. In some ways, government and socialism is preferable.
Here we go again. Kyle demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of what socialism is. This goes to show the failing of our education system, when a fucking political science major doesn't even understand basic definitions of political systems. This is embarrassing, dude.
So yes, there are some people who might be Marxists or anarchists or libertarian socialists or whatever they would describe themselves that listen to this show. But I disagree with them because I never really understood exactly what they're asking for and what they want and what their ideal is.
So what are you trying to say here? That you're stupid? You have almost 1 million subscribers, but you've never talked to anybody who can adequately explain to you basic political definitions or basic Marxist concepts? Again, this man is a poli-sci major and he doesn't even comprehend the basic theory behind common political ideologies. I'm not even a poli-sci and I could give you an adequate explanation of a slew of political ideas.
And to the extent any of them can vocalize what it is, it's mostly theoretical answers they give. Whereas, in my mind, I'm an empiricist. Just prove it to me and that's it. You got me. Just show me how, if it works in real life. And guess what? We see pretty clearly that the Scandinavian systems work spectacularly.
Again, the Scandinavian system only works because of militant labor, their relationship to actually existing socialism, and the fact that they still partake in imperialism and the plundering of the Third World. But of course, he's going to conveniently ignore all those things, right? Also, just a reminder, I feel like a broken record player saying this, but when you take the socialist countries and compare them to capitalist countries of equal economic parity, the socialist countries 93% of the time provide better living standards on average. There hasn't been one country in the last 2 centuries that has gone socialist, save Cambodia, that hasn't also seen a commensurate rise in literacy, life expectancy, access to human services, increases in average years in school, improved nutrition, and increased levels of personal wealth. So if third world and second world countries blow out their capitalist counterparts with respect to overall quality of life, what sort of implications do you think you could draw for a socialist first world country, Kyle?
So the evidence is there for my preferred system. You know, you talk to a run-of-the-mill right-wing libertarian, they can only tell you theoretically what they favor, because when you put it into practice, it sucks. I feel a similar way about the ideologies that are way to the left of me. Well, I'm a communist. Okay, well, where has it worked? Oh, but all the ones where it didn't work, it's not true communism. That sounds a lot to me like the people on the right-wing libertarians who say, oh, that's not true capitalism, where all these horrific places that are purely capitalist and they fail, they go, no, it failed because it wasn't purely capitalist. Right. Yeah, it's always the dodge, right? It's not true capitalism. It's not true communism. That's not true Islam.
Bullshit. It did work. Only infantile ultras and left liberals would tell you otherwise. People of my disposition, the scientific socialists, would tell you that it was socialism, and unlike the utopian trends, which have internalized bourgeois propaganda to the point to where they're indistinguishable from right-wingers on the topic, we will tell you that it did work, and that the socialist countries made massive strides and achievements in their day. Even China, which cannot technically be called socialist at this time, is on the path to becoming the world's #1 superpower. Compare that to India, another densely populated colonized nation from the region. One of these countries had a communist revolution, the other didn't, and look at the outcomes.
That's it. It's always, oh, no, it's not true, this or that. Well, I don't need to dodge or make, or bend over backwards to try to explain away failures.
And I don't need to close my ears and pretend like those failures and shortcomings never happened. Unlike you, apparently.
Because what I prefer hasn't failed. It's working right now.
And those successes are only allowed to exist because they're allies to the Western colonial bloc. Look what happened to non-Western colonial countries that try to implement your system, Kyle. They get treated with the good old coup d'etat, 10 times out of 10. You can cherry-pick the Nordic countries all you like, but that doesn't change the fact that your sockdem bribes are only tolerated because of us, and that if the wealthy had things their way, well, we'd be living in another Gilded Age. Anyways, that's all I have to say for now. Shout out to my Patreons. Your gratuity is greatly appreciated. You are the light sewing into my soul that keeps this project going, and the extra pocket change is definitely a good boost to morale. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I shall see you all next time.